In April 1945, British and Canadian troops stormed the gates of a Nazi concentration camp located just between the towns of Bergen and Belsen in Lower Saxony. According to the intelligence reports, Allied prisoners of war were held there. Their mission was to liberate the prisoners and move on their way to the heart of the Third Reich, Berlin. Nothing could prepare them for the brutality they were about to witness in Bergen-Belsen. Tens of thousands of rotting corpses and dying people, mostly Jews, littered the camp, barely resembling human beings. The camp had a staff of 480 Nazis working as guards or members of the Commandant's staff, including 45 women. But no matter their gender, these guards are among the most cruel and bloodthirsty criminals to ever live in this planet. Today, we will explore the horrors of Bergen-Belsen through shocking color footage, from its inception as a camp for prisoners of war to its transformation into a murdering machine responsible for the deaths of 50,000 innocent men and women. Life in the Nazi death camps. Worse than death. The Nazi doctrine of Aryan supremacy created a classification of people who were unfit. Unfit for work, for social contact, for life itself. Some who fell into this category were the mentally ill, the physically handicapped, the incurably sick, and the aged. Hitler, in his callous, pragmatic way, devised a means of removing the unfit from his country's hospitals. Euthanasia, also known as mercy killing. In October 1939, to make room to treat wounded soldiers, Hitler signed a secret order permitting doctors to grant a mercy death to any patient who did not appear able to recover. The code name for this clandestine project was T4, after the address from which it was coordinated, Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, Hitler's office. 6 euthanasia centers were established in remote areas throughout Germany. In these buildings, isolated from the rest of the world, more than 50,000 people judged incurable were humanely killed and their corpses cremated. Falsified death certificates were sent to their relatives. Doctors experimented with different methods of murder, carbon monoxide gas and injection with morphine, cyanide, and other agents. Gas chambers developed by an SS officer were installed at each center. Heinrich Himmler recognized the usefulness of the T4 operation to the concentration camps. The large-scale killing that was possible at the euthanasia centers was more efficient and less messy than the mass executions by firing squad that were commonplace at the camps. Rather than waiting for inmates who were barely alive to succumb to natural death, the SS could have the weakest declared unfit and shipped off to a euthanasia institute. They could even have political prisoners branded as mentally defective. Indeed, some psychiatric evaluation forms from Dachau and Ravensbrück listed such things as hostility to Germans and communism as symptoms of mental. Exactly how many people were euthanized in the concentration camps will never be known because many of the carefully kept records were destroyed, but the figure is probably at least 20,000. Once the directors of the concentration camp system embarked on a path of deliberate and barely disguised racial murder, each next step was logical, however twisted the logic had become. After legitimizing the killing of unfit people in euthanasia institutes and rationalizing the transfer of undesirables to those institutes, the obvious next move was to bring the medical murder directly to the camp. Then it was but a small step to establish facilities for which the sole purpose would be slaughter, not of isolated individuals, but of an entire race of people deemed unfit to live, the Jews. 4 extermination camps were built in 1941 and 1942, and 2 existing camps were reconstructed to become both labor camp and killing center. The code name for the policy of eliminating the Jewish problem by wholesale murder of all Jews was Operation Reinhard, after Reinhard Heydrich, the German security officer responsible for implementing the so-called final solution. Jews in the ghettos of Poland and some of the captured Russian territories would be resettled in the east, while Jews from Germany transported to the vacated ghettos. After a few days or weeks, the ghettos were again emptied to the east, and more German Jews relocated to the ghettos. The process was to be repeated until no Jew remained in the Reich. In the Nazi discourse, the east meant the death camps. The extermination camps were all located in the eastern part of Poland, where they were far from any criticism from German citizens. By late 1941, the vast majority of Europe's Jews were located in Poland and Russia, lands Hitler had targeted. Eastern Poland, near the Russian border, was an ideal site for implementing the final solution. The large tracts of forested land located there could hide or camouflage death factories lest anyone object and try to shut them down. A good railroad system provided easy access to almost any area. Many Poles were intensely anti-Semitic and would probably close their eyes to the torture of Jews. Although many other groups of people were interned throughout the Reich-held territory and became victims of Nazi fury, the Jews had been singled out not simply for harsh treatment, but for annihilation. Back in Germany, however, a network of camps for holding prisoners of war were in place, and although they did not form part of the final solution, their life conditions were almost as appalling. Bergen-Belsen, two names associated to horror. The men and women who were posted to the camp of Bergen-Belsen in northern Germany regarded it as a particularly good posting and felt what they were doing there was right. Although they were taught blind and absolute obedience to all orders from their SS superiors, on a number of occasions they felt able to criticize the way the camp was being run. Many of them, whatever they may have professed to their captors at the end of the war, actually believed wholeheartedly in the Nazi vision, and this meant that they felt free to question the details of its implementation. Many of the guards knew that they had embarked on something that human beings had never attempted before: the systematic extermination of thousands of men, women, and children in a matter of months. These men and women in the camps had created killing factories, whether they were extermination camps with gas chambers, or such as Belsen, where inmates were tortured, shot, starved, and left to die disease-ridden. They were concerned not about the suffering of the inmates, but about problems of how the camp would run smoothly and efficiently. Most of the guards considered that they lived a tolerable life. As guards, they lived in comfortable barracks with several of their comrades. For the officers, life was better still. Many stayed with their families in requisitioned houses nearby. They enjoyed a standard of living that far surpassed anything they could have achieved had they been attached to a fighting unit. Here in their homes, these men with their wives and children had created a settled environment and, for the most part, they had found a successful way of distancing themselves from life in the concentration camp. Almost every concentration camp operative was determined from the onset to conceal as much of the gruesome nature of its activities as possible from the outside world. In their own minds, it was not just their oath of loyalty they were protecting, but their own credentials as human beings. The Bergen-Belsen concentration camp became an important part of the official concentration camp system from the time it was established in April 1943. It differed from all other Nazi concentration camps in several key aspects. It was initially set up to hold Jewish hostages that were important for the SS for one reason or another. Their intention was to use them as currency, releasing them in exchange for Germans imprisoned abroad, foreign currency, or commodities that were valuable to the war effort. The character of the camp changed in March 1944 when a new section was established for sick male prisoners from other concentration camps who were no longer able to work. A section for female prisoners was set up in August 1944. In December 1944, the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp became the destination for numerous evacuation transports from other concentration camps. The camp's subsequent overcrowding and disastrous living conditions led to mass deaths which claimed the lives of around 18,000 victims in March 1945 alone. This is not counting the thousands that died during the infamous death marches, where prisoners were made to walk from camps such as Auschwitz to other more protected camps in Germany. The miserable state of the inmates, combined with the harsh conditions of the Central European winter, determined that most inmates never made it to the second camp. This was particularly the case in Belsen's satellite camp known as the Hohne camp. Some 15,000 prisoners from the Mittelbau-Dora camp had been marched under horrendous conditions and relocated there in early April. Mittelbau-Dora had been a sub-camp of Buchenwald concentration camp. Its prisoners had been worked to death by the SS mainly in the tunnel excavation situated near Nordhausen, where the V-2 rocket and the flying bomb V-1 rocket were produced. Life for the inmates there was terrible. Summary executions, deliberately being starved, and extreme cruelty were quite normal occurrences there. However, with the advancing Allied forces approaching Dora, the SS murdered those too sick to be marched, and those strong enough were put on a death march to the Hohne camp. While the SS continued to beat, starve and murder them in their new camp, many of the inmates were still in much better physical condition than those in the main Belsen camp. At least 52,000 of the total of around 120,000 prisoners in Bergen-Belsen died of starvation or disease, of the abuse they received from the SS, or of the immediate effects of their imprisonment following their liberation. Dead Men Walking: How the Allies Found Bergen-Belsen's Prisoners. On April 15, 1945, the same day that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was buried in Hyde Park, New York, the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp was turned over to soldiers of the British Second Army. This army was part of the Allied 21st Army Group, a combined British and Canadian unit. The surrender of the camp had been negotiated over a period of several days. On the afternoon of Sunday, April 15th, the first British units to enter the camp arrived in a van with a loudspeaker accompanying elements of the 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment of the Royal Artillery. One of the soldiers on the tanks was Chaim Herzog of the Intelligence Corps. He would go on to become Israel's ambassador to the United Nations and ultimately the 6th President of the State of Israel. Just a week earlier, there had been more than 60,000 prisoners in the camp, nearly half of them recently arrived from other Nazi facilities. From April 11th to April 14th, prisoners still able to work were forced to help the SS prepare for the surrender by burying bodies in mass graves. This must have been one of the most horrific sights known to mankind, so the Nazis made efforts to lighten it up by playing music. The British soldiers learned from the prisoners that during this harrowing task, the SS guards handed the prisoners musical instruments. While two prisoners' orchestras played dancing music, 2,000 inmates dragged the corpses using strips of cloth or leather straps tied to the wrists or ankles. This monstrous spectacle went on for 4 days, from 6 in the morning until dark. Still, there were 10,000 rotting corpses remaining in the camp when the British and the Canadian arrived. The inmates who survived to see the arrival of the Allied soldiers were suffering from starvation, typhus, and other diseases. Circumstances were so dire that at minimum, another 14,000 of them would die after liberation. The day after the camp was liberated, more than 100 ambulances driven by American civilian volunteers departed in convoy from Italy to Bergen-Belsen to assist in saving the surviving inmates. 100 ambulances were still not enough to transport thousands, and the Allies had to decide which of the prisoners had more chances of surviving and who was beyond the point of no return. The prisoners were described by the liberators as a dense mass of emaciated, apathetic scarecrows huddled together in wooden huts, and in many cases without beds or blankets, and in some cases without any clothing whatsoever. The females were in worse condition than the men, and their clothing generally, if they had any, only filthy rags. The dead lay all over the camp and in piles outside the blocks of huts, which housed the worst of the sick and were miscalled hospitals. There were thousands of naked and emaciated corpses in various stages of decomposition lying unburied. Sanitation was to all practical purposes non-existent. Pits with wooden perch rails acted as latrines, but the inmates, from starvation, apathy, and weakness, defecated and urinated where they sat or lay, even inside the living huts. They had not showered for months, as there was no running water or electricity in the prisoners' facilities. For the British, there were several problems to take care of after liberation. The first one was to stop the typhus from spreading. It had already consumed hundreds of prisoners, and in their condition, it was bound to affect the rest in a short time. Next, they needed to bury the dead before the hot summer brought cholera. They also needed enough rations to feed the sick in the camp, who were dying of starvation more rapidly than of their illness. Removing from the horror camp those who might live with some form of systematized feeding and nursing was also a priority, and so was helping those who lived regain their humanity. As they soon learned, this was no easy task, and as a combat force they were mostly unprepared to handle a humanitarian mission of such proportions. Many of the camp buildings were repurposed to house the ailing prisoners, but at first the British Army only had 8 nurses for a population of 20,000 sick people. It was decided that around 300 operatives of the Royal Army Medical Corps would stay behind to care for the sick people in Bergen-Belsen. These patients were suffering from the most virulent diseases known to mankind, and all of them required urgent hospital treatment. The 30,000 men, women, and children might not die if they were not doctored, but would most certainly die if they were not fed and removed from the horror camp. The sick were at first laid on soiled beddings on the ground, as there were almost no beds available. Also, the few nurses and medical corps did not have thermometers, drugs, dressings, bedpans, or any of the essentials of medical treatment. And worst of all, they did not share the same language with the prisoners, so communication was very difficult. The unspeakable cruelties of Bergen-Belsen's women camp. Of the 55,000 guards who served in Nazi concentration camps, about 3,700 were women. In 1942, the first female guards arrived at Auschwitz and Majdanek from Ravensbrück. The year after, the Germans began conscripting women because of a guard shortage. Most women who were recruited to become overseers were middle to low class, from non-professional backgrounds, and many of them had no previous work experience. As a group, the women guards were not highly regarded by their inmates, who were often educationally and culturally superior. Volunteers were mostly German women who were recruited by advertisements in newspapers asking women to show their love for the Reich by joining the SS organizations for women. A few entered service this way, attracted to the promise of light physical work and good wages. But countless young women were recruited under stronger incentives from SS officials. They were told to choose between continuing their menial position indefinitely or joining the SS. The position of a women guard paid well, and in 1944 an unmarried women guard in her mid-20s could make considerably more than she could as a textile worker. By 1943, the Reich Labor Ministry was empowered to conscript women between 17 and 45 years of age for labor service, and by the end of that year, most of the women reporting for concentration camp training were conscripts. Ravensbrück served as the main training ground for some 3,700 female guards after 1938. Trainees spent anywhere from a week to 6 months at the camp, at first being given regulated instruction from the head overseer. The trainees were taught the standard regulations applicable to all concentration camps, how to detect sabotage and work slowdowns, how to prevent escapes, and how to punish prisoners within the parameters of camp regulations, and so on. It was emphasized that female guards were to have no relationship of a personal nature with any of the prisoners. The guards were notoriously cruel, yet not all women became accustomed to brutality. On the contrary, some were sympathetic to the needs of the prisoners. However, those that deviated from the standard mentality often faced despair and were severely punished as a result of their insubordination. In the eyes of their superiors, their ultimate aim was to gradually accustom the recruits to the brutality of camp life, step by step. Bergen-Belsen became an important place for testing and training female guards, especially since August 1944, when a part of the concentration camp was sectioned off and turned into a women's camp. Between August and late November 1944, the SS imprisoned around 9,000 women and girls in this part of the camp. Most of the women and girls who were able to work only stayed in the women's camp for a short time before being transferred to other concentration camps, or the 3 satellite camps of Bergen-Belsen as slave laborers. During the first few months, the women were provisionally housed in tents in a large open space within the camp. Fortunately for them, in November 1944, just before the start of the harsh German winter, a storm completely destroyed the tents in which the women were housed, and they were assigned to huts. These huts were cold and infested with rats and fleas, but it was still an upgrade from the outside tents. The first prisoners in the women's camp were Polish women who had been arrested during the Warsaw Uprising and deported, in some cases with their children. The camp was filthy, wet and cold. The women were hungry, unable to keep themselves clean, and contracted infectious and deadly diseases such as typhus. Because more and more Jewish prisoners were taken in, the camp became overcrowded, and things got worse and worse. Most of the later prisoners were Polish and Hungarian Jews who had been transferred from Auschwitz. Among the women who remained in Bergen-Belsen were Margot and Anne Frank, who died there in March 1945. Anne's written testimony remains one of the most chilling portrayals of the utter savagery that was life in the camps. Transferring the methods of Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, Josef Kramer and Irma Gräser. Not only prisoners were transported from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen. As the war progressed, it became clearer to the Nazis that the Polish camps would not hold much longer. Some of the most notorious camp commandants were transferred from Poland to more protected camps in Germany. It also became a necessity to get rid of as many prisoners as possible, especially those who were unfit to work because of how deteriorated they were. And although Bergen-Belsen never had a gas chamber, like many other death camps, the SS guards and commandants developed their own instruments of extermination. Johanna Bormann, a camp guard known for her cruelty to prisoners, was transferred from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen in late 1944. As soon as Johanna arrived, she was assigned immediately to roll call duties. Some weeks later, her immediate superior from Auschwitz, Irma Gräser, was also transferred to Bergen-Belsen. Back in Auschwitz, Gräser's name was synonymous with brutality. She became known as the hyena of Auschwitz. Gräser is one of the most notorious cases of SS training in action. In 1943, aged 20, she was transferred from Ravensbrück to Auschwitz, where she became an overseer, controlling 31 barracks housing some 30,000 women. Although she had mistreated prisoners at Ravensbrück, Auschwitz afforded her much greater opportunities for doing evil. Always tidy and immaculately groomed, she strutted around the camp with her shiny black boots, carrying a whip and wearing a smart-looking SS uniform. The prisoners were terrified of her sight, because she was always looking for victims she could torture or kill. At Belsen, she was determined to inflict the same misery as in Ravensbrück and Auschwitz. The Belsen commandant, Josef Kramer, also came from Auschwitz, where he had worked with Gräser and reportedly developed a romantic relationship with her. Thus, when she was reassigned to another camp, she asked if she could stay at Belsen instead. To her female colleagues, it seemed that SS matron Gräser wanted to remain at that typhus-ridden hellhole just for the love of her SS boyfriend. Yet, as Johanna Bormann soon found out, Irma was in fact secretly having an affair with an SS guard named Franz Hatzinger. Hatzinger and Gräser had met each other while they were stationed at Auschwitz. He was a married man and 14 years older than Gräser, but it was clear to Johanna that they both were very close and regularly sneaked off secretly to have sex. In spite the deteriorating military situation and their apparently rich social life, the women continued to inflict the same sort of terror and cruelty they had become notorious for at Auschwitz. Prisoners were dying all around them, and typhus was rife throughout the camp. But Gräser and Bormann would order frail, emaciated prisoners to undergo strenuous exercises, including making inmates hold heavy rocks over their heads for extended periods of time. This did not have any productive objective, other than providing a source of pleasure to the sadistic female guards. Josef Kramer was no better than the women. In December 1944, Kramer was transferred from Auschwitz-Birkenau to Bergen-Belsen, where he was promoted to the role of commandant. Kramer's rule was so barbaric that he became known as the Beast of Belsen. Even as the Reich became squeezed by the advance of both Soviet and Allied troops and the administration of the camp broke down, Kramer remained devoted to bureaucracy and continued his reign of terror on the inmates. As a result of his unrestrained barbarity, many thousands starved to death. However, his reign would not last long, as the general situation of the Reich was falling apart fast. During the last weeks of the camp's operation, Kramer had been concerned that administration was breaking down. Camp life had deteriorated so much that many of the inmates simply did not have enough strength to get up. Many of the prisoners were badly emaciated, their arms and legs like matchsticks, their bones protruding through their skin. Many of those who had been evacuated to Belsen had been herded into the camp and left to die. Once they had died, the corpses were left lying around. The stench of decomposition was overpowering. On the last days before the liberation of Belsen, the camp had descended into such disorganization that Kramer could no longer cope with the amount of new arrivals. He was particularly scathing towards his subordinates and, as a result of the deteriorating situation, encouraged his men to become even more vicious. The pressure was so enormous that often guards who had shown some degree of restraint towards the deportees were now observed whipping and beating women and children. Some murdered them with their own hands or shot dead anyone who would not respond quickly enough to an order. SS Captain Franz Hössler arrived at Belsen to control the situation on 8 April 1945 and became deputy camp commander under Josef Kramer. One of his first orders to the guards was to begin shooting and beating the prisoners, activities in which he participated himself. On 15th April 1945, when the British liberated the camp, Hoesler was found hiding among the prisoners in camouflaged clothing and was detained with the remaining SS staff by a unit of the British Army. Kramer, Hoesler and Irma Grez were all executed by the British executioner Albert Pierrepoint on December 13, 1945, ending the camp, but not the horrors, the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. Liberation of the camps did not end the suffering. Thousands of people who had been starved, beaten and worked to exhaustion died within their first week of freedom. For many, their bodies simply gave out. For many others, the rich food the rescuers thought would nourish them to strength was more than their deprived systems could handle. In Dachau, the daily death rate in the days following liberation was 200. In Bergen-Belsen, it was almost 500. Storming Bergen-Belsen was not among the plans of the Allies. In early April 1945, troops of the British 11th Armoured Division were mobilizing across northern Germany near Hamburg in the direction of Berlin. It was part of the final push towards Allied victory over the forces of Nazism. At one point, they were met by a German man carrying a white flag. He claimed to have come from a place called Bergen-Belsen, and he requested a truce. The British officers in charge of the division were not interested in negotiating with him, but the camp of Bergen-Belsen lay further ahead on their path of advance. They thought it was a good opportunity to free some of their comrades who were possibly held captive in the prisoner of war camp without firing a round. Thus, they agreed to go to Bergen-Belsen. There was a catch, however. The envoy sent to negotiate the truce explained that typhus had taken hold in a prison camp there and that there was a danger of the disease spreading beyond its confines. On the 15th of April, soldiers of the 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment were the first to enter the Belsen camp. Nothing they could have seen in the 6 years of war could have prepared them for what they found inside the camp. When the Allied soldiers stormed the camp in April 1945, they found 60,000 people who were on the verge of dying and 13,000 unburied corpses. Because of the typhus outbreak and the lack of manpower, nobody had bothered to bury the deceased. During the following days and weeks, it is estimated that 500 people died every day due to the ongoing typhus epidemic that had been going on in the camp for months. The 15th of April was a happy day for the inmates at the concentration camp, but their suffering was far from over. Bergen-Belsen was never meant to become an extermination facility. However, due to the cruelties of the war and the inexperience of the British and then Canadian soldiers who liberated it, the number of casualties was unusually large. And perhaps the most tragic fact is that out of the 50,000 people that died at Bergen-Belsen, around 35,000 lives were lost just in the few months before the liberation. These Jews never knew how close they came to being finally free. In the weeks and months that followed, British soldiers, medical personnel and volunteers brought a certain degree of order into the ghastly chaos. The dead were buried, the sick were treated and rehabilitated, barely living skeletons began to have their humanity restored to them, and the children even began to enjoy fun and games again. Once the situation was somewhat contained, the British turned their attention to those who had been responsible for the atrocities that were revealed to the world in April 1945. Foremost amongst these was the commandant of the Belsen camp at the time of its liberation, SS Captain Joseph Kramer. Kramer had been in charge of Belsen concentration camp since December 1944, having previously been a senior camp administrator at Auschwitz, where he oversaw many of the gassings of Jews in the Birkenau subcamp. Towards the end of the war, because Bergen-Belsen was located in the heart of the German land, it became a reception camp for many of the prisoners evacuated from camps further east as the Soviet army advanced westwards. This, of course, resulted in the chronic overcrowding, starvation and disease discovered by the British liberating forces. These conditions were made even worse by Kramer's brutal regime, which earned him the nickname of the Beast of Belsen. During his time in Bergen-Belsen, the camp became one of the most deadly, perhaps the deadliest camp in Germany without a gas chamber. On April 20th, the camp was attacked by 4 German fighter planes, probably alerted of their position by the German soldiers that were allowed to go back to the front lines by the British. As a result, 3 British medical orderlies died, and the water supply of the camp was damaged, which in turn provoked more deaths because of dehydration. Over the next days, The surviving prisoners were deloused and moved to a nearby German Panzer Army camp, which became the Bergen-Belsen Displaced Persons Camp. Over a period of 4 weeks, almost 29,000 of the survivors were moved to the Displaced Persons Camp. Before the handover, the SS had managed to destroy the camp's administrative files, thereby eradicating most written evidence. The British did force the former SS camp personnel to help bury the thousands of dead bodies in mass graves. It was the same task the SS had asked the inmates to do over and over again in the past. The British knew this and gave the SS personnel the same treatment they had given the Jewish and Polish prisoners before. The SS men were given starvation rations, not allowed to use gloves or other protective clothing, and were continuously shouted at and threatened to make sure that they did not stop working. Some of the bodies were so rotten that arms and legs tore away from the torso. Within 2 months, 17 staff members had died of typhus due to being forced to handle the bodies with no protection. Another committed suicide, and 3 others were shot and killed by British soldiers after trying to escape. The truth comes to light: the Belsen trials. The so-called Belsen trials happened 5 months after the liberation of the camp and were the first of their kind, held even before the famous Nuremberg trials took place. The Belsen trial attracted considerable international media attention. It gave the world its first real glimpse of the fathomless horror of the Holocaust and of the death factory that was Bergen-Belsen. It was also the first occasion on which film was submitted as evidence in a war crimes trial. The trial lasted 54 days. It began on the 17th of September with the indictment and the opening speech for the prosecution. On the 20th of September, the British Army screened a film they had made of the conditions at Belsen immediately after liberation. This proved extremely effective, and it was reported that some of the more impressionable witnesses had to leave the room due to the graphic nature of the footage shown. On 21st September, the court visited the camp at Bergen-Belsen. Evidence for the defense began on the 8th of October, with the opening speech for the defendant, Commandant Josef Kramer, who also testified. Closing speeches were made from 7th to 12th November, followed by the closing arguments by the prosecution on 13th November. Sentencing took place on the 17th of November, 1945. Historians are very critical of the Belsen trials, which were done in haste and without proper preparation. None of the SS guards who had fled the camp after the ceasefire on the 13th of April had been searched for. Instead of eyewitness testimony, in some cases only affidavits were available at the trial. Some witnesses contradicted themselves on cross-examination, while others failed to identify the defendants as the perpetrators of the crimes in question. One former inmate, Oskar Schmitz, was erroneously charged as an SS man and had no chance to clarify this before the trial began. In turn, the defense attorneys claimed that the arrest of the defendants had been illegal, as it contravened the promise of free withdrawal contained in the ceasefire agreement. But according to the prosecution, the burning of the camp files by the SS and the firing of shots on 15th April had voided the agreement. On 17th November, the court sentenced 11 of the defendants to death by hanging. Another 18 were found guilty and sentenced to prison sentences of 1 to 15 years. Erich Zodl, one of the camp guards, was sentenced to life in prison, but was then executed 13 days later after a separate military trial in August 1945 found him guilty of murdering a female prisoner after the liberation. The famous British executioner Albert Pierrepoint was appointed by the British Army to carry out the hangings. Despite him being a low-ranking officer, the Army directed that he was to be treated as the equivalent rank of lieutenant colonel. He was flown over to Germany for the specific task of conducting the executions and put in a luxurious hotel, where he was collected by jeep every day to be driven to the prison. A total of 191 men and 10 women were hanged at Hamelin, plus one man, Theophil Walasek, who was shot. Albert Pierrepoint carried out all the hangings himself and with great professionalism. He was assisted in the task by Company Sergeant Major Richard Anthony O'Neill, Sergeant James Hunter, Edwin James Roper, and Alexander Hurry. A British female prison governor or deputy governor had to be present at female executions. The deputy governor of the English Strangeways prison, a woman named Wilson, was present for the first 3 on the 13th of December 1945. Apart from these people, the executions were carried out with a very limited audience. A gallows was set up in the west wing of the main prison building, in the Lower Saxon town of Hamelin. This wing was kept separate from the rest of the prison. The gallows was modelled on the design of the one at Pentonville Prison in London, which had trapdoors wide enough to permit double hangings, which were the norm there. Prisoners were permitted the services of a minister of their religion prior to execution. Some of the prisoners rejected these services. Josef Kramer was executed in silence, but her lover Irma Gräser did not go easily. She was the youngest woman to ever be sentenced to death under the British law and refused to wear the traditional black hood, violently trying to shake it off. She wanted to be able to see the executioner to his eyes until the final second, but finally the guards held her while Pierrepoint placed the black hood. Then Gräser, who was 22 at the time, yelled, "Schnell!" meaning quickly, while waiting for Pierrepoint to pull the lever. But it was not a quick death. Pierrepoint, an experienced executioner who had been overseeing these procedures for over 15 years, placed the noose wrongly in Gräser's neck, causing her a painful death by strangulation rather than her neck snapping. Her death was as horrifying as her life,